There are a ton of big fighting games releasing in 2026. It's probably the most jam-packed year we've had in a while. We got Invincible Versus, Marvel Tokon, the Avatar fighting game. However, there's one fighter that's being released that I have heard almost nobody talking about, which is crazy to me because it's the next installment in a long-running series all based on a beloved franchise. I'm talking about Final Fantasy Dissidia. Yes, there's a brand new Final Fantasy Dissidia game that just released, and I have seen nobody in the FGC talking about this. Why is that? I mean, it looks... They're, going for a big change in the style. Everybody's got brand new modern-day outfits, but you know what? That's cool. It gives it its own vibe, gives it its own look. And the graphics, okay, sure, admittedly, they are a step down from the last game, but you know what? That's okay. I often talk about how it's fine for fighting games to not have the most cutting-edge graphics. It doesn't bother me. And you know what? Hey, the gameplay looks... Oh, I see. No more Final Fantasy fighting game for Thorgy, huh? Well, fine. I'll make my own Final Fantasy fighting game with Tifa and fast-paced tag mechanics. Actually, that sounds hard. Let's just make a builder roster. Hello, fighting game and fantasy fans alike, and welcome to another episode of Build a Roster, the show where we take a hypothetical fighting game and build our dream roster around it. And ever since I started this show all those years ago, I had a list of topics I eventually wanted to get to, and this was a big one. Not only does Final Fantasy have its own fighting game franchise, but I'm also just a Final Fantasy fan. I started with 9 and fell in love with it in the whole RPG genre, and I've been following this series ever since. But last year, I got the wild idea. Hey, I still got some gaps in my education. I love this franchise, but I've only played about half of it. So I decided that I was going to go back through and play every mainline Final Fantasy game that I had never played before. And just this month, I finally completed this side quest. I have now played all the numbered Final Fantasies. Except the 2 MMORPGs, but that's a whole other mountain to climb. Not going to go into it too much right now, but I do just want to say, damn, what an incredible series. I'll admit, each game does have some issues with them, but I still found stuff in each of these titles that I enjoyed. I came away from this big year-long journey with some brand new favorite games, new favorite songs, and definitely some new favorite characters. And just like with every franchise that I love, I always wanted to see Final Fantasy turn into a fighting game, and I'm not the only one. Final Fantasy getting shoved into fighting games is a tradition at this point. There's Clive and Noctis in Tekken, Cloud and Sephiroth in Smash Bros, and of course, a whole mess of characters in... You never really get used to that sound. And on top of that, a few weeks ago, a rumor from a fairly reputable leaker said they had info that a new Final Fantasy character might be coming to Street Fighter. I swear I started working on this video before that rumor emerged. This is just insanely good timing. Well, years back, we finally got our wish as Final Fantasy launched its own fighting game, Final Fantasy Dissidia. I'll admit, I wasn't huge on this simply because, as I've stated many times on this channel, arena fighters just aren't for me. Nothing wrong with them, it's just not my style. But I know people did love this game, and hey, I have to admit, all those big super moves looked amazing, and I even enjoyed going on YouTube and seeing all the cutscenes of these characters from different storylines interacting. And the game eventually got a sequel with Final Fantasy Dissidia NT, which wasn't nearly as well received. But hey, wouldn't you know it, the same month that I wrapped up this year-long journey to play all these games, the latest installment in the Dissidia series dropped. Except now it's no longer a fighting game, instead it's a mobile 3v3 team boss battle arena. Whatever the hell that means. Well hey, Dissidia might have moved on from the realm of fighting games, but you know what they say about nature and vacuums. People want their Final Fantasy characters to duke it out, so it feels like it's the perfect time for me to finally do that Final Fantasy build the roster. Except, yeah, having not played half the games until this year was only one of the reasons I hadn't tackled this topic yet. There was a completely different reason that I hadn't done the Dissidia builder roster before, and I do have to bring it up because it is going to affect the rest of this video. You see, in case you're new to this show, part of the challenge of Build a Roster is figuring out how to build an interesting roster while staying within a realistic roster size. And when it comes to Final Fantasy, yeah, there's no way to do that. You can't make a roster for a Final Fantasy fighting game that's both interesting and realistic. I always start this show by saying, let's figure out the roster size, and realistically speaking, a roster for a new Final Fantasy fighting game would probably be around 20 characters. There have been 16 numbered Final Fantasy games. If you had a roster of 20 characters, that would be the protagonist of each single-player game, one character from each of the MMORPGs, the 4 most popular villains, and yeah, that's it. That's the show. Good night, everybody. Hit that subscribe button on your way out. Yeah, like I said, I've wanted to do a Final Fantasy Builder roster for the longest time, but this has always been the biggest roadblock that stopped me. I have tried to think of unique twists that we could do. Maybe we could only do one Final Fantasy game, but then you run into the opposite problem where there's now so few characters that you would just put the entire roster into the game, and again, that's boring and predictable. Maybe we could only do the heroes, but that's still like 80% of the roster predetermined. This was driving me nuts. It really feels like you can't make an interesting Final Fantasy roster until like Season 5 of DLC. So yeah, screw it, we're just going to do all 5 seasons of DLC. That's right, normally on this show I do the base roster and then maybe 1 or 2 seasons of DLC. But today, in order to keep this show interesting, I'm going to do the base roster and 5 seasons of DLC all at once. Not only does this make the roster more interesting, but also this lets me go through each game in order, and when you're covering 16 games, trust me, this is way better for the overall flow of the video. So yeah, I'm going to say that this game would launch with 20 characters, but then after 5 seasons of 5 or 6 characters per season, that would finish off with 45 to 50 characters, which I will be evening out to 48. But in case you're curious, I will be putting a little asterisk on screen whenever I talk about a character who is going to be in the base roster. Although, real talk, who is and isn't in the base roster isn't really that important because at this point, Build the Roster is less about who could actually be in a hypothetical roster, and it's more about brainstorming how would this character who isn't in a fighting game play in a fighting game. Which brings me to the next point that I need to address. This is not a new Dissidia game. Yeah, we know how these characters would play in that franchise. We've seen it multiple times. But what about a traditional 2D fighting game? Final Fantasy has never had one of those, and they've never even guest starred in one. Unless those leaks about Street Fighter turn out to be true, but again, we'll worry about that down the road. So let's say that the team behind, I don't know, Grand Blue Fantasy Versus got their hands on Final Fantasy. They already have experience turning a sword and sorcery fantasy series into a fighting game. They could probably get the job done. And today we're going to figure out how these classic characters would work in a totally new style of fighting game. In other words, as if you couldn't tell from this lengthy intro, this is going to be a far more talky episode. It's going to be less hype fake reveal trailers and more nerdy brainstorming. So if you're one of those people who use me as a sleep aid, you're welcome. However, just because I'm going with a massive roster size doesn't mean I still don't have a ton of wacky rules to throw in here. First up, I am only focusing on the numbered Final Fantasy games. I know people are going to argue that I should include the spin-off games as well, but guys, I'm going with 48 fighters because it's the only way to get an interesting collection of characters and not just go with the protagonist and villains of each game. The moment that I throw in here spin-offs, guess what? We're right back to where we were in the beginning, where every game only gets the hero and villain. So we're not doing that. And speaking of the heroes and villains of each game, yeah, I don't have to include the heroes and villains of each game. Again, I want to make sure that this roster is interesting, and while I do think that most of the heroes and villains are good and do deserve to be in here, there's some who just did not land. Quick, don't look it up. Who was the villain in Final Fantasy XIII? I think I've proven my point. And lastly, I want each of the numbered games to be represented without any one of them taking up too much space. I know that 7 and 14 are the 2 most popular Final Fantasies, but that doesn't mean that they should take up half this roster. So, here's the rule. Each game has to have at least 2 characters, but can't have more than 5. That way, everyone gets some love, but not too much. Also, this isn't really a rule for this episode, more of just my philosophy on every episode. I like to get a good variety of characters in terms of their moves and personalities. And that will indeed have an impact on this roster. Normally I don't have to make that clear, but it's Final Fantasy. there's a whole lot of dudes with swords and wizards throwing around spells, so you might see some odd picks in here just for the sake of variety. Also, one final thing that I want to throw in here. Hey, Ed or Thorgy coming to you guys from the future. I had always heard stories about Square Enix being really protective of their music. Turns out that's true. Yeah, I have uploaded this thing about 5 times now, and I have gotten multiple copyright claims each time. I think I have gotten it to where it is safe, but in the off chance that you are watching this in the future and there is a part of this video that is muted, that's the reason why. However, if that ends up happening, then I will upload the unedited version with all the music intact, and I will put a link to where you can find it in the description down below. Either it will be an unlisted video here on YouTube, or it will be up on our Patreon. Again, if that happens, check the description down below for where you can find it. But there you go, that's all the rules, that's all the clarifications, that's everything that we need to discuss. Time to get into the roster as we travel back in time to where it all began. The original Final Fantasy saved Square from going bust and kicked off one of the biggest video game franchises ever. And yet for our purposes here today, it's pretty light. In this game, you don't actually play as a character, you play as a role. You know, fighter, black mage, thief, stuff like that. However, these heroes were referred to as the Warriors of Light. And since then, whenever they retell the events of the very first game, they use this character design and just refer to them as the Warrior of Light. So, that's our first character. And since the Warrior of Light is essentially the progenitor for the rest of the heroes in this series, the one who they all came from, I figured it makes the most sense for them to be the all-rounder. Average speed, average strength, give them a fireball for a projectile, their sword gives them some decent range, but not nearly as long as some of the other characters in here. This would be the most right down the middle character in this roster, implying that every other character in this game could be interpreted as a variation of them, like they're all using him as a blueprint. Then for our second character, it has to be Garland. Like I said, there is almost no named characters in this game, but even with that being said, Garland, the big bad boss, has continued to be a striking and iconic figure for this franchise. For their moveset with that massive suit of armor and gigantic sword, Garland is our big tank. This guy set the stage for all intimidating final bosses that followed after him, so you want him to fight in a way that makes him feel truly unstoppable. He'd march across the stage at a fairly slow pace, and he would have big lumbering sword swing attacks, but each of those attacks would have armor on them, which is appropriate for an RPG boss. Your party hits them 4 times and they shrug it off, they hit you once and you're almost dead. Also, I should bring up that Garland, like most Final Fantasy bosses, transforms into a giant nightmare abomination when you get to the final battle. Way I see it, that's a real easy big level 3 cinematic super move. Also, one last thing to say about Garland. I know there are tons of people right now leaving comments down below about what they did to that character in Strangers of Paradise and how they interpreted him in there. Folks, that is a spin-off game, so for our purposes here today, it does not count. We are not going to be including any of that. And secondly, don't go spoiling that for people. Let them discover it on their own. But that is Final Fantasy I, the simplest of the games that we're going to be talking about. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Final Fantasy II was far more narratively focused, with named party members and a story that was shockingly good for an NES game. I went into this one not expecting much at all, but it was far grander and a hell of a lot darker than I was expecting considering the time that this game came out. I'd always heard that this was a frowned upon installment in the series, but I really enjoyed it. Now, speaking of that darker tone, let's get our first character out of the way, the big villain of the game, Emperor Mateus. This guy is going to fight, for lack of a better term, like a summoner. No, not like that. That comes later. In this game, the Emperor summons out monsters. Lots of monsters. The game starts with him summoning a horde of bombs to attack a city. When you face him in battle, he has waves of monsters pop up between you and him that you must fight through first. When you try to challenge him, he makes you fight a behemoth. Controlling monsters is like the main thing this guy does. So in this game, all of his special moves would revolve around summoning out monsters that would act independently of him. have him summon out bombs that travel across the screen and then blow up, have flying monsters go across the air to keep your opponents from jumping at you, have a super like Gargos in Killer Instinct where he calls out a little minion that just walks across the screen, constantly attacking you. This is admittedly a very niche fighting game archetype, but the Emperor easily fits it. Then for our second character, I'm going with the protagonist, Firion, the leader of the Wild Roses, the rebels opposing the Emperor, and yeah, that's kind of it. That's kind of all we got on him. I mentioned that Final Fantasy II was far more narratively focused, but that was in comparison to the first game. So what it basically meant was characters now had names and backstories, and that second part was optional. Yeah, there really isn't a ton to Firion's personality, at least not in the game itself. There have been some other materials out there that have been published that have fleshed him out a bit more, but just looking at the game itself, there's not a lot that we can pull from for his moveset. So, what about his gameplay? Yeah, there really isn't much there either. This game allowed you to equip whatever weapons you want or use whatever spells you want, so no character was really unique. Everybody could be whatever role you want them to be. However, there is something that Final Fantasy II did that was very different. And not necessarily in a good way. You don't level up in Final Fantasy II. No, instead, after each battle, your stats go up based on what you did in the fight. And that extends to your weapons and spells. Yet each time that you learn a new spell or equip a new weapon, it starts at level 1 and it is really weak. Then you have to grind like crazy to rank it up. Remember how I said I'd always heard pretty negative stuff about this game? This is why. This weird level up mechanic is the entire reason that people do not like this game. Because yeah, it doesn't work in an RPG. But it could be fun in a fighting game. Hear me out. Let's make Firion a fairly straightforward character, except he's got 3 special moves, and they all start at level 1. But each time that you successfully land the attack, it levels up. We'd have to adjust how much they would level up, do they reset between rounds, you know, stuff like that. But this would be a way to take the most iconic feature of Final Fantasy II's combat and incorporate it into a fighting game. Final Fantasy III was a big return to basics for this franchise, which is a weird thing to say about a game that's only on its 3rd installment. It used a job system, kind of like what you had in the first game, where each character isn't really a character. They're more of just their job, and you can swap between them. I mean, sure, each of these party members did now have names and even a brief backstory, but they're mostly just known as the Onion Knights with no real defining traits. But even if there isn't much to these characters, I can't leave out the Onion Knights. These little chivalrous chibis have become iconic. You see an Onion Knight, you think of Final Fantasy. Plus, I think you could do something pretty cool with these little guys. Since each Onion Knight is basically the same, just with different jobs, let's say that you have your one Onion Knight there in a suit of armor and they just fight with a sword, pretty basic stuff, but each of their special moves call in another Onion Knight in a different job to do their own attack. Then you use those attacks to link your various combos together, almost like they come with their own built-in tag fighter assist character. You do some sword slashes with your Onion Knight, then you summon in the Black Mage Onion Knight to do a fireball that juggles the opponent up a bit, then you keep attacking with your main Onion Knight, then you finish it off with the Monk Onion Knight who comes in there and does a big super punch, and while your opponent is getting up off the ground, you have your White Mage Onion Knight come in and put up a barrier around you that can block projectiles. I would love to see all these little guys popping in and out of a combo. It would be the closest thing that we could get to attacking with a full RPG party. Now as for the second character from this game, I was really tempted to go with Zondi. Everybody always picks the Cloud Darkness to represent the villain in this game, but the plot largely revolves around Zondi, so it feels like they should finally get a chance to shine. But then when I actually played the game, I learned, yeah, Zondi really is not in this game that much. Don't get me wrong, neither is the Cloud of Darkness, but audiences really overhyped Zondi to me over the years. For years I had heard people saying, yeah, he's the big threat of the game, the story is all about Zondi. Then I played it, you fight him once, the Cloud of Darkness then steps in and goes, okay, let's get this guy out of the way. And yeah, his story is kinda done. So sorry Zondi, Cloud of Darkness takes this spot once again. Although I will say, in the Dissidia games, they gave her a human body, but in the actual games, she's, you know, a Cloud of Darkness. She's one of the few bosses that don't transform into a giant monster because she's already a giant monster. So you know what? Let's get weird. Let's have Cloud of Darkness fit that all-important fighting game role, Big Thing. You see, there are fighting games with big buff characters, but then there are those that go beyond that. When you have a character that is just simply a big thing. Sentinel, Blitztank, Kusarigito from Samurai Showdown, those two playable mid-bosses from Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, there might not be a ton of them, but they are an established archetype, and a belovedly weird one at that. So let's make Cloud of Darkness huge, with big hand swipes that go across the stage, powerful energy blasts, give her a teleport where she just turns into an actual Cloud of Darkness and slides across the stage. With these big powerful attacks that hit all over the screen, Cloud of Darkness would be the one fighter in this roster who actually makes you feel like you're controlling a Final Fantasy boss. Final Fantasy IV, to me, is when Final Fantasy became Final Fantasy. It's the first game where each character had an established role, which I get why people enjoy being able to customize their jobs, but to me, it gives each character more personality. It also provided a richer and deeper story with far more fleshed out characters and the largest cast yet. And because this game was so important, it's going to be our first game to get more than 2 characters. For FF4, we're going up to 4. First up, the protagonist of the game, Cecil. Cecil starts off as a Dark Knight working for an emperor who has gone mad and sending his troops off to attack innocent villages, and Cecil is wondering if he should continue to follow orders that he knows in his heart is wrong. Well, this internal struggle comes to a head when he faces his own dark reflection, and then he goes from being a Dark Knight to being a paladin who fights for peace and justice. Well, with a description like that, how can he not be our stance fighter? He'll start out as a Dark Knight, and in this mode he does big damage, but each of his specials drains his own life. But then he can swap to being a paladin, and now he'll do less damage, but his specials will actually heal some of his life back. Meaning if you want to play this character well, you're going to have to learn how to balance these two sides. Then we'll throw in Cecil's friend and on again, off again, constantly being brainwashed rival, Kain Highwind. Dragoons are some of the most iconic character classes in Final Fantasy, and Kain is the Dragoon. Hell, his pose on the box art is what people think of when they think of Dragoons. So if we want to make sure that this job gets represented, he's our guy. And since the thing that makes Dragoons unique is their jump ability, where they fly into the sky and then come down a turn later, Kain is going to be all about aerial attacks. Give him the classic Dragoon attack where he leaps into the sky and then slams back into the ground. Give him a launcher where he sends the opponent flying and then Kain soars up after them to do some aerial combos. And give him a special that can only be done in the air where Kain rockets down to the ground at an angle to catch the opponent off guard. If it can be done in the air, Kain is going to do it. Then Final Fantasy IV also introduced our very first named summoner character, Rydia. Summoners are a huge part of Final Fantasy. I would be willing to say that summons, crystals, moogles, chocobos, and guys named Sid are the 5 most iconic elements of this franchise. But up until this point, summoners were just a job. But now, Rydia was a fully fleshed out character who specifically came from a village of summoners. So Rydia would fight almost like she comes with her own assist character. Each of her specials would be calling out a summon to do an attack that she could then use to link her combos together. Kinda like what I described with the Onion Knights. And lastly, we have to include the villain of the game, Golbez. I'll admit I was hesitant to include Golbez because, well, we already got Garland in here, and Golbez and Garland are both big dudes in black armor, and you typically want your fighting game characters to be very visually distinct. But, it's just different enough, it's probably fine. But as for his playstyle, I'm not looking at Garland, instead, I'm looking at a totally different villain. And I'm going to take inspiration from Dormammu in Marvel vs. Capcom. In that game, Dormammu has a charge ability where he can power up 2 different types of spells multiple times, then combine those charges together to create a new unique move. I bring this up because in Final Fantasy IV, Golbez is on a mission to collect all the elemental crystals. So, let's make that his moveset. We'll give him some basic specials to start with, but he can charge up his own unique crystal meter with 4 different types of charges to reflect the 4 different types of crystals. And depending on what you charge up, it can change his special moves around to give them some new properties or power them up. Making Golbez a character who takes a lot of work to get right, but it comes with a big payoff. At the start of this crazy year-long journey, I honestly hadn't heard much about Final Fantasy V, so I went into this game not expecting much, and I came out of it loving it, and now it's probably my top 5 favorite Final Fantasy games. It's got a sense of humor to it that makes it stand out from the rest of this series, and while it brought back the job system, it arguably handled it better than any other game so far. Now, as for who's going to be in the base roster, I'm not actually going to go with any of our heroes. Instead, I'm going to go with the big villain of the game, XDeath. Yes, the villain of Final Fantasy V is called XDeath. I told you this game has a sense of humor to it. I'm going with the villain here because I don't want our starting roster to just be the heroes and then a handful of villains where we can fit them. In order to spice things up, I do want to have a few games be represented by the villain. Plus, in the Dissidia games, XDeath was voiced by M. Bison, so, yeah, I'm pretty sure that automatically gets him into a fighting game.
Searching for something? Continue down this path, and there will be no return for you.
Now, XDeath is going to be our first big zoner of the game, because sure, in combat he does throw a ton of big spells at you, but guess what? Every Final Fantasy boss throws a ton of big spells at you. That doesn't make you special. However, outside of combat, in just the little scripted scenes that you get, XDeath still loves to just mess with our heroes by attacking from afar. He sends out the crystals to attack them, he'll trap them in bubbles as they get hit by energy attacks, while XDeath just stands in the back and watches. So in combat, this guy isn't going to move much, but you're still going to have a hard time approaching him. But as I said, we are going to include XDeath in the base roster, but that doesn't mean we won't have the protagonist of the game himself. Yes, later on in DLC, we will be adding Bartz. And yes, I know his name in Japanese is Butts. It's like the most famous thing about this game. In Japanese, the hero's name is Butts, and he comes from a town called Licks. We have all made the jokes, but the localization team snuck in here way too many Simpsons jokes for me to not call him Bartz. In fact, speaking of those jokes, that's the big reason why I need to include Bartz in this game. Because we're going to have a lot of Final Fantasy protagonists in here, and Final Fantasy protags, listen, they're great, they're wonderfully fleshed out characters. But they also have a bad habit of being...
I just feel like I've heard those words somewhere before. It's so frustrating, as if the memory is floating out of reach.
I thought it was finished.
We have been called upon to serve a new purpose.
By Cosmos?
No, by the heiress of her will.
We should hurry. Gotta see how things are.
This is dumb. I'm here for a summon. If you know where it is, then spit it out.
Monotone. Really, really monotone. But Final Fantasy V, as I have mentioned multiple times now, is easily the most jokey game in the franchise. And Bart is way more laid back and playful. He's actually kind of goofy, and I say that as a positive. It would make him a big breath of fresh air in this game. But how would he fight? Again, characters that use the job system make it hard to pick a particular playstyle for them, but there is something about Bart that makes him unique. His buddy Boko. Bart's best friend is a chocobo, and chocobos are some of the most iconic creatures in all of Final Fantasy, so you know what? Feels like we should find a way to work that into his moveset. Give Bart a special where Boko runs across the stage, give him a down attack where Boko pops up out of the ground, knocking the opponent up into the air, and give him an install super where he just hops on Boko's back and now he has armor on all of his moves for a limited amount of time. I did say that I could see the team behind Grand Blue Fantasy Versus making this game, and what I just described is basically Lil Wayne's human pyramid attack, and everybody loves that attack. I mean, if they're using it, otherwise they hate the move, but hey, that sounds like the definition of a good super to me. So with Boko by his side, I think we could spice up Bartz enough to make him worth including. But even if we couldn't, even if Bartz was just the most standard all-rounder you could imagine, a total reskin of the Warrior of Light, I would still demand that he be put into this game. Because he has to be in this game, so that way we can get the run back of the century with our next fighter.
But hope springs anew, for the Genji is made whole, perfect and sublime. So for Gilgamesh, it's Morphin time!
Gilgamesh. I said that Final Fantasy V became one of my favorites in the series, and Gilgamesh is a huge part of that. This guy is a big blowhard goofball, and I love him for that. You find him multiple times throughout the game, going from villain to playful rival to kind of friend at the end. And even if you've never played Final Fantasy V, you probably still know Gilgamesh because at the end of the game, he gets sucked into the Rift, the realm of nothingness between dimensions, and since then, he has continued to pop up in multiple Final Fantasies. And in many of them, it is confirmed that he is indeed the same Gilgamesh, now on a quest to get back home so he can fight Bartz again. In fact, that's another reason why I didn't include Bartz on the starting roster. It's so that way we could announce both these characters as DLC at the same time. That reveal trailer would be great. But beyond that, Gilgamesh's other goal is to collect all the other legendary swords that he can get his hands on, and he has a lot of hands. In multiple games, he is seen holding replicas of famous weapons from other characters throughout this franchise. So if we have a Final Fantasy fighting game and Gilgamesh isn't in the roster somewhere, something went wrong. Plus, if Gilgamesh is in the game, that means that we can put his theme, Battle on the Big Bridge, in here, and I want Battle on the Big Bridge in here, I need Battle on the Big Bridge in here. How am I supposed to enjoy my Final Fantasy fighting game if it doesn't have... This song is pure hype. That horn section goes so hard. Now, since Gilgamesh has multiple arms and he fights with multiple swords, he has to be a Rekka fighter. Let him do long combos that you can continue to add on to with additional inputs, and each new input sees a different weapon being swung out. This could give him a lot of variety to his combos and easily mix up your opponents. You start with one big sword swing, but then you follow it up with either an overhead or a low, and your opponent has to react fast or take their best guess. Also, we have to give him a cinematic super, where he pulls out the legendary blade Excalibur, only to notice it's actually Excalibur, throws it away, and hits the opponent in the head. That would be the most disrespectful way possible to win a match. Is this ever a big one? Many people consider Final Fantasy VI to possibly be the best in the franchise, and honestly, yeah, I can understand why people say that. It's the touching story of a team of weirdos who have to come together and save the world a year after a genocidal clown destroyed the planet. And I say weirdos with endearment. This isn't just the largest party in any Final Fantasy, it's also the most varied and unique. You get everyone from a mysterious ninja to tiny girls with magical painting powers to gambling airship pirates to a dancing Moogle and his Yeti berserker friend. This cast is huge, they're crazy, and I love all of them. So I am going to bump this cast up to 4 characters, but even with that, it was a real tough choice about who to include. Although our first pick was easy, it's Terra. She has to be in here, she's the protagonist of the game. Kind of. Yeah, that's the interesting thing about Final Fantasy VI. It starts with Terra, but there are multiple points in the game where other characters take over as the main focus, and those go on for a long stretch of time. However, if you ever ask anyone who is the star of Final Fantasy VI, yeah, they're going to say Terra. Now, one thing that makes Terra unique is that she can use magic in a world where that's kind of gone extinct. So I wouldn't say she's going to be a zoner, she could definitely fight physically with her sword, but out of all the heroes that we've had so far, she's going to be the most focused on casting spells. In fact, there are so many big legendary spells across Final Fantasy that we should probably divide them up among this roster, so I say we give Terra the Ultima spell. In fact, make that her level 3 super, but let's say that each character can have up to 5 bars of meter, and Terra can do Ultima, but then she can also burn those extra 2 bars of meter to do Ultima again, because without getting into it too much, the dual cast ability in Final Fantasy VI is insanely broken. Also, Terra has a power-up that she can go into. I'm not going to go into too many spoilers about that, but for our purposes here today, that means that she is definitely going to get this form as an install super that will allow her to temporarily move faster and fly around the stage. Then you have to include the big maniacal clown, Kefka. He's easily one of the most iconic villains in all of Final Fantasy, and in the second half of the game, he gains godlike powers and just keeps firing a laser beam at everyone from his tower, so that of course needs to be one of his supers. And like with most of the bosses, his big level 3 would be him transforming into his giant kaiju form. But outside of that, how would he fight normally? Well, Kefka is kind of a... how can I put this delicately? An asshole. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. He's constantly dancing about and laughing and tricking people, so we would want to make Kefka a big counter-heavy character. He could twist and step around the opponents, set up reflect spells that send attacks back at them, and we could even give him stats effects like poison that would slowly drain the opponent's life. Because Kefka kinda knows a lot about that. In other words, Kefka would easily be the most annoying character in this game. But I don't think any of the Kefka fans out there are going to argue with that. That is a very accurate way to describe him. Then after that, there's so many other good team members that we could choose from, but you know what? I don't think that Celeste gets nearly enough respect. I see people bring up other party members from Final Fantasy VI all the time, but I think that Celeste is constantly being overlooked. Despite the fact that halfway through the game, she kind of becomes the new protagonist. That's all I'll say, go play the game for yourself. So yeah, let's finally let Celeste have a moment in the spotlight. Now, I'm picturing Celeste would fight like the exact opposite of Terra because Terra was a magic user who got turned into a soldier. Celeste was a soldier who was experimented on to become a magic user. So let's say Terra would fight with 75% spells and 25% physical attacks, but Celeste would fight with 75% physical attacks and 25% spells. Terra would fight more from a mid-range with some good long pokes from her sword, whereas Celeste would get right up in your face, doing decent-sized combos with her sword and then ending things off with a big explosive spell. Terra would also be quicker with some lighter attacks, and Celeste would be slower with heavier attacks. And for her level 3 super, I know that with a character like Celeste, we should probably go with something serious. But nah, I'm going to say we make it a cinematic where she does the opera performance. But as she's doing it, the goofy recurring villain Ultros drops an anvil on the opponent's head. Because Final Fantasy VI is a very touching and serious story that also has really goofy comedic moments in there. And lastly, if I can only have one more Final Fantasy VI representative, I have to choose Sabin. Sabin's a good dude, he's a monk who travels around the world helping people and punching his problems away, but the reason why he has to be in this roster is because in Final Fantasy VI, everyone has their own unique powers, and Sabin gets access to a wide variety of moves that are all his own. And how do you do these moves? By inputting fighting game commands. Yes, quarter circle forward punch, half circle, charge inputs, 360, he literally puts fighting game moves into a Final Fantasy. So, I must repeat what I said about Gilgamesh, if you are making a Final Fantasy fighting game and this guy isn't in there, something went wrong. He's the only person who comes to this interview with a resume. He is prepared for this thing. But beyond that, the most important thing that we need to point out is that this game must have the full fighting game spectrum represented. And we've got all-rounders, we've got zoners, we've got unique weird character types, but we don't have a grappler yet. And what, pray tell, is the most famous thing about Sabin, nay, about all of Final Fantasy VI in general? Yes, one of Sabin's moves is a suplex. And the clip of Sabin suplexing the Ghost Train is one of the biggest running gags about this entire franchise. So if there is anyone in this roster who is going to be the grappler, it's going to be the guy whose grapple is his most iconic moment. In fact, I'll even say it right now. I know he's got really big, powerful moves in the game aside from his suplex, but that also has to be his level 3 cinematic super. Have him pick the opponent up, slam them into the ground, and as they're getting back up, they then look up, and Sabin is flying down on top of them, ready to slam the Ghost Train into them. Do I need to actually say anything about Final Fantasy VII? It's not only the most famous installment in this franchise, it's one of the most iconic video games, period. It was a literal game changer for this entire medium. So of course, it is going to be our first game to get the full 5 fighters. But even with all those roster spots, it was still hard to pick who would be in here. This whole cast is so memorable and they're so unique that we could create some really interesting and varied movesets with some strange, unique choices. So I of course went with the 5 most basic and obvious picks you could possibly make. Sorry, but I know how dedicated FF7 fans are. I'm not taking any chances on this one. First up is Cloud Strife, and you know how I said that the Warrior of Light would be the all-rounder simply because he's the one that all the other characters came from? Well, when you got a roster this big, it's okay to have multiple all-rounders. And since this is an archetype that tends to be pretty accessible to all players, it would probably be a good idea to give that to the most popular character who everyone is going to want to play. So yeah, Cloud would be another all-rounder. Ish. He wouldn't be exactly right down the middle with that giant sword of his. He would definitely be more focused on offense with higher attack values and longer reach, but he would have lower defense because, well yeah, Cloud really gets put through the ringer in this game. But if you want an easy to understand character with decent tools but with a little extra kick, Cloud's your guy. Also, I should point out right now that the supers for the Final Fantasy VII characters are going to be incredibly easy to figure out because their limit breaks are literally divided by power levels. You want level 1, level 2, and level 3 super? They're right there. Next up, gotta go with Tifa, one of the most popular characters in the game, and because she's a brawler who knows how to throw hands, it feels like she was made for a fighting game. Not you, like a good fighting game. People have been begging for years for Tifa to be in a fighting game, and I would like to remind everyone, I wrote this before those rumors started dropping. That is how much people have been asking for her to enter the world of fisticuffs. And her playstyle is super easy to figure out. I just mentioned that each character has limit breaks in this game that are divided up by power levels, so when you unlock a stronger one, you switch over to using that one. But Tifa is the only character who doesn't follow that trend. Instead, every time that you unlock a brand new limit break for her, it adds on to her existing limit breaks, meaning she just gets to keep doing longer and longer combos. If that doesn't scream Wreck-A-Fighter, I don't know what does. You start with one special and then you can just keep linking them into your other specials one after another. Then I'm going to go with the leader of Avalanche himself, Barret. Now, why am I choosing him over so many other possible party members? Well, he is one of the earliest characters that you meet, so he is pretty memorable. Even people who just started this game know who this guy is. And he's one of the most important characters to the plot. But real talk, he's got the biggest personality of this entire cast. And it is a bombastic personality that would be amazing in a fighting game. Especially in a fighting game where, no offense, but as I said with Bart's, a lot of this roster is going to be super serious and monotone. After 10 characters all speaking in low, serious, straight faces, having him hop in here and start screaming about the planet would be a very welcome relief. Now as for his playstyle, this is kind of an interesting case because he moves like a tank. He's big and slow and made of muscles. But his specialty is using his gun arm to lay down suppressing fire. So let's say that he's got his Wrecking Ball arm equipped to deliver big, heavy blows. But his specials all fire out shots from his gun arm to stun the opponent or juggle them in the air, giving him plenty of time to run across the stage and deliver big, devastating punches. So he'd be a big bruiser, but those types of characters always have a weakness of trying to get in on the opponent, so his gun arm would allow him to create those openings. Then for the next character, do I even need to say this one? Oh, is Sephiroth popular and one of the most memorable video game villains of all time? Wow, that's a spicy take. Yeah, there's no question why Sephiroth is on here. Only question is how does he play? And that was really hard to figure out because many of the villains have some kind of an obvious gimmick or their design implies a particular fighting style. But Final Fantasy VII goes out of its way to say, no, Sephiroth is just the baddest dude who ever existed. He's fast, he's strong, he's powerful, he's got magic, he's got physical attacks, he kinda does everything. So he would have a pretty varied and decent toolbox at his disposal, but I still think that he would lean into zoning. With that massive sword of his, he's going to have the longest normals of any character in this game, and he's got tons of damaging magical spells that hit from a distance. And with him being a one-winged angel, I can see him having a flight ability that allows him to zip around the stage and temporarily fly away from the opponent. Or maybe you could give him a counter, where if the opponent strikes you, then Sephiroth turns into one of the robed test subjects that you see walking around the game, and then he appears behind you and stabs you in the back. In other words, Sephiroth is going to be a guy who you have to work to chase down. Then when you finally reach him, he can still mess with you and just vanish again. Which is kind of the Final Fantasy VII experience in a nutshell. Also, just throwing it out there, but purely for flavor, if Sephiroth wins by time over, have an animation of the stage being destroyed by meteor. Then for our last character, this is another tough one because, as I said, it's obvious that Final Fantasy VII has the most famous cast in this franchise, and for the longest time I put Vincent in here because he was popular enough to get his own spin-off, and hey, who in the 90s didn't like this walking horror movie reference? But in the end, I couldn't ignore Aerith. Yeah, I kept her off the roster originally because she's the healer of the team, and that's pretty much all she does. She heals, making her a difficult inclusion in a game all about punching. But she is so beloved and so iconic that we have to put her in here. Plus, I do enjoy when fine games have to get clever with how they interpret characters, and this is the perfect opportunity for that. Okay, for starters, she would be probably the most defense-focused character in this roster. Final Fantasy games have a whole collection of shields and other protective spells, so we could give Aerith a move where she puts a wall around her that blocks projectiles or gives her a hit of armor. We could say that her heavy attack sends out her little energy baubles. They wouldn't do a ton of damage compared to the other characters in this game, but they would buy her some breathing room. Also, while white magic is known for healing and defense, it does have a handful of powerful big damage spells like Holy, so we could give that to Aerith. In other words, Aerith's whole playstyle is really weak normals and low defense, but then big powerful specials that hit hard or buff her weaknesses. Also, for pure flavor, one of the supers has to be a cinematic of her hitting the opponent with a chair, and if she does that to Sephiroth, she gets a unique animation of her leaping down on him and shoving her staff through his chest. Yeah, that's what really sold me on this inclusion. Giving Aerith the opportunity to get her run back on Sephiroth, that's all I needed to hear. Final Fantasy VIII, everyone's favorite Final Fantasy when they were 15. Yeah, Final Fantasy VIII is odd. Not bad, I'm not saying that's bad, but opinions on the game are all over the place. Probably because the story is also all over the place. Yeah, this game always felt like it was just every cool idea that someone had thrown together, but without a ton of cohesion between it. You're a child soldier, but you're in a futuristic city, but then you're also fighting dinosaurs, and now you're leading the school, and you have to try and stop modern-day looking politicians, but then you have to fight a sorceress who's trying to control all of time, and you have dreams where you're maybe your dad, and then you just go to space, and you also have magic amnesia, and did I mention this was also a love story? All this is to say the game has its fans, but it's also got problems. So we're going to go with only 3 characters. First up is Squall, the peak of 90s moody teenage protagonist. If I could sum up Squall's personality in one word, it would be...
whatever.
He is definitely very disassociated and indifferent. He is a guy who keeps being forced to go into social situations, but all he wants to do is stay in his room and play card games. Bro, same. Which is going to make it very ironic that his playstyle is going to be pretty aggressive. Yeah, from the moment that this game begins, you see Squall tends to go all in his fights, often charging in head first without worrying about what happens to his own body. But also, what's Squall's weapon? A gunblade. It's a gun with a sword attached to it. That does not sound like a weapon that cares about blocking. So to really drive home this aggressive combat, let's give him a move where he loads his gunblade. Then at any time, you can input that command again to make the sword fire, laying out a big explosion. And if you do that in the middle of a combo, it would send the opponent flipping into the air or flying backwards for a wall bounce, setting up for much larger combos. I know I just said that Squall does charge in head first, but that's kind of how he is in the beginning of the game. Towards the end of the game, he gets far more strategic, and knowing when exactly to use your gunblade attack would be the sign of a more strategic fighter. Then we have Rinoa. Rinoa is a member of a resistance army fighting against her father's military. She's Squall's love interest, and she also is heavily tied to the sorceress that this entire game centers around, but none of that is important. What really matters is that Rinoa has a good boy named Angelo. Yes, she's got a dog that she summons out for all of her limit breaks. So the obvious move here would be to let her summon out Angelo for her specials. And yes, that does sound similar to what bards can do with Boko, but bards and Boko will be a bit more focused on power. A giant bird running across the screen? Get out of the way or else you're gonna get hurt. Rinoa and Angelo are going to be a bit more focused on strategy and mix-ups. Rinoa attacks high while Angelo runs in and attacks low. Rinoa attacks low, Angelo jumps in for an overhead. Or her normal weapon in the game is a ring that she can throw out and then it returns back to her. So give her a special where she fires that across the screen, but then after a second, it comes back, hitting the opponent both times. So you can throw this thing out, and then you can run in on the opponent, and they're going to just have to keep blocking and let that happen, because that ring is going to come back any moment now. In other words, most of Renoa's attacks will be there to set up another attack, and that'll really throw the opponent for a loop and keep them on their toes. And for the last character from Final Fantasy VIII, we're going to go with the villain Ultimecia. This sorceress had the master plan to take control of time itself. Okay, it was actually far more complicated than that, but this video is running long as it is, so the important thing is, she was all about controlling time. So, that's how we're going to build her moveset. She'd have a few generic energy attacks like any good Final Fantasy boss, but we'd also give her the ability to freeze the opponent in place. Give her a rewind ability where she undoes the last few seconds of the match, teleporting her to a previous spot on the stage. A counter where the opponent attacks, only to then be rewound themselves. There aren't a lot of fighting game characters who use time mechanics, but there's definitely enough that we can work with it. And now we come to Final Fantasy IX, the one that started it all for me and is still my personal favorite. This game took a break from the futuristic and heavily mechanical worlds of VIII and VII and was meant to be something of a throwback to the earlier games, which is one of the reasons why I've always said that if you want a game that really captures the classic Final Fantasy formula, you go with IX. And I'm not the only one who loves this game. Whenever people discuss the best games in the series, IX is always in the conversation. So because of that, I am going to go up to 4 characters again. And we're going to do something unique with this one. This will be the first cast of a game where all the characters will have a mechanic in common. In Final Fantasy IX, when a character's life points got low enough, they would go into a powered-up Super Saiyan state known as Trance Mode. So let's say that with these 4 characters, once your life total hit the critical range, they would each get access to a brand new install super called Trance. And Trance would buff each of these characters, but would buff them in a different way. So maybe one character gets faster, one character gets stronger, one character gets armor on some of their moves. That way, even though they all share this mechanic, they would each continue to fight in their own unique way. Now first up, the protagonist of the game, Zidane. Yes, I always said Zidane as well, but apparently it's pronounced Zidane. At least until that remake that's been rumored forever comes out and proves me wrong again. Now, I've already made reference to this, but outside of the games that use the job system, typically your party members would have designated roles, and Zidane is the only protagonist who fits the thief role. Up until arguably Vaughn in Final Fantasy XII, but we'll talk about Vaughn later. Thieves don't do a lot of damage, but they're fast and crafty, so Zidane is going to be our first rushdown character. Very quick dagger slashes that don't have big range or big damage, but he can get in there quickly, jump around your opponent to avoid and counter their attacks, and then do some long combos. And let's give him the Thief's most iconic move, Steal. Let's say that this is a unique ability only to Zidane, and when you begin a match, your opponent will have a number of coins underneath their life bar, where Zidane will start with no coins. But he'll have a move called Steal. This will basically be a throw that does very little damage, but whenever you do it, your opponent will lose some of their coins and they'll get added to Zidane's side. As the match goes on, the fewer coins you have, the more of a debuff you'll get to your defense, and the more coins that Zidane has, the higher his attack becomes. We'd of course have to tinker around with this to make sure that wasn't too broken. We'd have to balance how much of a debuff you get, how much of a boost he gets, and of course we'd have to figure out a way that you could get your coins back from Zidane, like let's say you counterattack him while he's trying to do the steal move, or if you hit him after he steals your coins within a limited amount of time. But after we figure all that out, I think this would be a great ability to give him. The thief roll and the steal move are very iconic to Final Fantasy, but unless you plan on money matching your opponent, this is probably the only way that we could implement. Next up, Kuja, one of the most popular villains in the series, so he has to be in here. But his playstyle was a bit hard to figure out. He's a sorcerer who casts big spells and can summon out black mages and monsters, stuff we've kind of already seen in this roster. So how do we make that interesting? How do we spice it up? Well, that's where we incorporate some story elements into his gameplay. You see, Kuja had a massive superiority complex. I know, a villain with a huge ego in an RPG? I'm shocked. But he eventually found out that he was mortal, just like everybody else, and, oh boy, he didn't take it well. He kinda snapped. So let's say that Kuja fights with spells and projectiles, the kind of things that hit around mid-range. But when the match begins, he has a shield around him that heavily increases his defense. But once you get his life bar down to half, The shield breaks, his defense plummets, but now all of his spells and offense powers go through the roof. So for half the game he has low offense, high defense, the other half of the game he has low defense, but very high offense. In fact, I mentioned each character from Final Fantasy IX would get the Trance install super. Maybe with Kuja, the moment that his life bar gets down to below half, he just automatically goes into it. Then for our next character, I know everyone wants Vivi. He's one of the most popular characters in the history of Final Fantasy. Even if you know nothing about these games, you've probably seen this little black mage. But, I'm not going to do that. At least, not entirely. Hear me out. Vivi is a good boy. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. Plus, he's another spellcaster, which translates to another zoner, and yeah, folks, we're starting to get real heavy on those. However, I thought of a compromise. You see, Vivi isn't much of a fighter, but he's got a friend who is. Steiner. For anyone who didn't play the game, Steiner is a knight and he hates Zidane. The amount that Steiner just loathes this little monkey man is hilarious, and it's also kind of endearing. However, Steiner likes Vivi. He's totally chill with Vivi, treats him with the utmost respect. And in the game, Vivi and Steiner actually have a team-up ability where Vivi can infuse Steiner's sword with his own magic. So, our next fighter is not Vivi, it's not Steiner, it's Steiner and Vivi fighting as one. On the field, you'll be controlling Steiner. He's big, he's slow, he hits hard, but you'll have to run his tin can butt across the stage to try and keep up with your opponents. However, all of his special moves will be calling out Vivi, who will appear behind him, throwing out fireballs to travel across the stage or have ice attacks fall from the sky. Basically, he'll lay down suppressing fire with his magic to keep Steiner safe as he lumbers his way across the stage. Not only does this show the teamwork between these characters, but also knights in Final Fantasy tend to have a recurring ability where they can protect their other party members. So the fact that Vivi will constantly appear behind Steiner, meaning that he'll never get hit because Steiner will always be in the way, is a great way to interpret this ability. And of course, one of their moves has to be using the sword magic ability, where Steiner would temporarily get an elemental boost to his basic attacks. He could have the fire sword that would do burn damage over time, lightning damage that would do higher chip damage, or ice damage that would leave the opponent temporarily slowed down. And for our last fighter from Final Fantasy IX, it's going to be something of a curveball, because it's not going to be any of your party members. Although she probably should have been. It's Beatrix. Okay, so long story short, Beatrix works for the evil queen in the game, and she's kind of a badass. She was basically the Terminator. You fight her in the game, and she just wipes the floor with you. But that's a pretty common trope in RPGs. You constantly have scripted fights that you're supposed to lose, then you get stronger, then later you fight that villain again, and you win. Except that never happens. No, you fight Beatrix multiple times, and she always wins. However, as the story goes on, she realizes she's been fighting for the villains. She's on the wrong side, so she eventually comes over to your side. Or, more accurately, the evil queen is, not really a problem after a certain point in the storyline, but we're not talking about that right now. What matters is that eventually she does become an ally. However, she never actually becomes a party member. You get one mission where she teams up with Steiner and she's on your party then, but outside of that, she never actually joins your team. Despite the fact that everyone who played Final Fantasy IX was absolutely positive that was going to happen. Listen, we all know how these games work. You spend this whole game setting up this character to be a lovable badass, and you know that she's going to eventually join your side, and then it eventually happens, so of course she's going to become a party member. Right? Right? Well, you know what? We had a character that the fans always wanted to be playable. Screw it, let's make her playable. And her playstyle would be a tank. As I said, she is essentially unstoppable. You can't beat her. So, let's make her a tank. She has no projectiles, she isn't super fast, but give her armor on her specials and heavy attacks so that way she can just plow through whatever her opponents are throwing at her. In fact, let's get super flavorful with it and say that if she loses, she doesn't fall to the ground. No, instead she just jumps away like she has another mission to go on. And each character would have a level 3 super in this game, but she could have a second one, Stock Break, which in 9 is the move that she always ends the fight with after you've done enough damage to her. So let's say that in this fighting game, she can only do this move if both she and the opponent are in critical health. In other words, it's the move that she uses after she's taken enough damage and it's time to end the fight. I mentioned that Final Fantasy IX was my first Final Fantasy, and as such, it is my favorite. However, if you ask me what is objectively the best Final Fantasy, yeah, I'd have to say 10. The game has an incredibly creative story, very unique setting, memorable characters, and arguably the most emotional story in this entire franchise. I have yet to see someone play through this game who didn't cry at the ending. If there is one Final Fantasy I would suggest starting with, it has to be this one. So let's see if I can somehow talk about this roster without spoiling anything. First up, the game's protag, Tidus. And yes, I said Tidus. I know that people are going to argue it's Titus, and I've been saying Titus for years because the whole game is themed around water and it sounds like Tide. But in Dissidia, they said Tidus, so I guess we're all just going to have to learn to live with that. Have to include Tidus. I don't care how ridiculous his outfit is, he is way too important. Although, just like with so many other Final Fantasy protags, he does carry around a big sword, so you might be concerned that he's going to be a bit too repetitive. Well, don't worry about that, because Tidus isn't going to fight with his sword, because Tidus is going to be ballin'. Blitzballin', that is. That's right, everybody's favorite sport that is so easy to learn and is in no way the most hated thing about this game will be what we build his moveset around. Sure, his normal attacks will be him swinging around his sword, but each of his specials will be him kicking a blitzball at the opponent. Let's say you can bounce it off the wall behind the opponent, have it spin in the air for a moment before firing on its own, or you could get 3 attacks, one that hits medium, one that hits low, and one that hits high. You could chain these moves together in order to easily mix up your opponent. You fire a shot low, your opponent blocks it, but then you immediately follow it up with an overhead shot that catches them off guard. Now, something to bring up, I'm not including Tidus' dad, Jet, in the game. Don't get me wrong, he's a great character. Well, he's a greatly flawed character, but that's what makes him such a good element of the story. However, minor spoilers, you don't get to ever fight him in the game. At least, not him. Yeah, that's as far as I'm going to go without spoiling anything. My point is, 10 doesn't really give us anything unique that we could pull from in order to build his moveset. Yes, I know he was playable in the Dissidia games, but again, those are spin-offs, we're not looking at them. However, we do know that he was also a blitzball player, and he also used a sword. See where I'm going with this? Make Jet a special skin for Tidus. Like one of those really fancy top-of-the-line DLC ones where it comes with unique voice lines and a victory animation, but the moveset of a guy who fights with a sword and blitzballs is all the same. In other words, it'd be a way to sneak in here another character without having to program a brand new fighter. In fact, you know what? It's just occurring to me right now as I record this, we could also do this exact same thing with Cloud and Zack in Final Fantasy VII. That's all I'm going to say, because after that it gets kind of spoilery. Now, you might have noticed that I didn't list Tidus as being in the starting roster. That's because to get some more variety in here and fewer dudes with swords, the starting roster representative for Final Fantasy X is going to be Yuna. Except it's not going to be the Yuna from Final Fantasy X. It's going to be Yuna from the sequel, Final Fantasy X-2. I know I said that I'm not doing spin-offs, but X-2 is a sequel, so technically it slides past that restriction. But also, Yuna in the first game was really soft-spoken. She was a healer, and that's kind of all she was. And again, you could turn that into a moveset, but we already did that with Aerith. In X-2, however, she was a fighter. Plus, she used guns, and in a game where almost everyone is either using swords, staffs, or spells, this would really help to make her stand out. Although I am going to let her keep her summons from the first game. I know people are going to argue, wait, so she has the moveset from the second game, but her summons from the first game? How does that make sense? Hey man, you know the rules of build a roster. If it makes for an interesting moveset, I'll allow it. Plus, you know this game would come with a totally original storyline. You could absolutely put in there something where she temporarily regains her summons. But now I'm dancing way too close to spoiler stuff. Plus, this is a Final Fantasy fighting game. You really should have more than one character who is a summoner. Although Yuna's summons won't work the same way that Rydia's did. You see, in the early Final Fantasies, summons would come down for one move, and that's it. But in Final Fantasy X, the summons would stay on the field and fight for you. So, let's say that Yuna's basic moveset revolves around her guns. Maybe you could also work in there the dress spheres for her specials, where she transforms for one move, but for each of her supers, she would summon down one of her Aeons. And after summoning it, it wouldn't leave after one attack, it would remain on the battlefield for a limited amount of time and fight beside her, making her a character that would leave your opponents completely overwhelmed. You think you finally figured out how to handle Yuna on her own? Well, for the next 8 seconds, she's also going to have a little dragon on screen that's going to be constantly blasting you with magic attacks. Good luck. Then we come to... there's no other way of putting it. Just one of the coolest characters in all Final Fantasy. A guy who farms aura so much it's practically his name, Auron. Auron's going to be one of the slower characters in this game. He kind of just strolls into places at his own pace, and his sword swings are definitely focused more on power than speed. But that power? Ooh man, does he have it in spades. This is a guy whose big overdrive attack is just knocking an opponent over the horizon. So yeah, slow but hits hard, not a lot more to say beyond that. I know that makes him a pretty simple character, but after Yuna and Tidus and all the crazy hijinks I had with the characters from 9, yeah, I think we need a simple character. And for our final character from 10, you probably already guessed that we're going to go with the game's big villain. And you'd be wrong. Yeah, we're now starting to enter the era of possible hot takes in Final Fantasy, and while I think Seymour is an interesting villain with good commentary and enough psychological damage to keep a therapist in business for years, I don't think people really like him. And I don't mean that in terms of, oh, he's a despicable bad person, so you're supposed to hate him. No, you're also supposed to hate Sephiroth. You also think that guy is cool. I mean, I think people just look at this guy and go, oh yeah, him. I don't know, that's just the vibes that I get. I mean, heck, as I previously mentioned, they didn't even choose him to be the villain rep in the previous Dissidia games. It was Jet, a guy who, as I said, is barely in the actual game. So no, this is our first game where I'm going to skip the villain, and instead, you know what? It's been a while since we had a wild card, a character you probably wouldn't expect, so I am filling this spot with another fan favorite, Lulu. Everybody loves Lulu. She's got a wonderful deadpan delivery, a style that every goth kid in the 2000s instantly fell in love with, and I'm pretty sure she breaks the record for most belts ever worn by an RPG character. However, when people talk about the big faces of Final Fantasy X, she often gets pushed to the back of the line simply because she's not that important to the overall plot. I mean, Tidus, Yuna, Auron, they've all got their own storylines going on. Riku's got a whole thing going on with the Albeds. I mean, heck, even Wakka has a whole character arc of him learning not to be racist. Lulu is kind of just there to be cool. But what can I say? She is really cool. Good job, devs. Mission accomplished. And as I have mentioned multiple times in other videos, fighting games are an amazing place to let smaller fan-favorite characters finally shine. So let's give Lulu that chance. And I'm sure most of you are expecting me to say that she would play like another spellcaster since that was her role on the team. And don't get me wrong, she will be blasting out big magical spells. But as for her unique gimmick, in the game, when Lulu does her normal attacks, she sends her little doll out to run across the screen and attack. Can you think of any fighting game archetype that sounds like? Yep, Lulu is going to be our puppet fighter in the game. She'll fight by sending her doll across the screen while she stays in the back and covers them with spells. Also, as just a really unique, weird callback to the game, maybe we could give her a dodge, and if you time it frame perfect with your opponent's attack, then when she gets out of the way, a lightning bolt could come down and zap your opponent, stunning them in place. For anyone who didn't play the game, you'll just assume she's casting her thunder magic. If you did play the game, you know what that's a reference to. And if you haven't played the game yet, but you're thinking about picking it up after watching this video, I apologize in advance for this section. It might be the worst thing in any Final Fantasy. And here we come to one of only 2 Final Fantasy games I have never played. Because you see, when it came to Final Fantasy XI, Square decided they were going to look to the future, to the bright, shiny new land of the World Wide Web. And they were going to make this game an MMORPG, and you might be thinking, well, that was the style at the time, everyone was doing it. Here's the thing, no it wasn't. This game came out 2 years before World of Warcraft kicked off the MMORPG revolution. Yeah, this was a wild leap, and a lot of Final Fantasy fans felt completely lost. They had no idea what to make of this. However, the people that did play it seemed to really enjoy it. In fact, I still see people saying they play it to this day, and it's still getting updates every now and again. But that doesn't change the fact that this remains one of the lesser known chapters in Final Fantasy's history, so we are only going with 2 characters. Now, I know I said that I never played this, but I promise all you 11 fans that I did the work on this. I watched tons of lore videos, read up on the characters, all to find the choices that I feel would fit the best, and then at the end I just picked the 2 most obvious characters who nobody will be surprised at. First up, Shantoto. If you know anything about Final Fantasy XI, you know about Shantoto. She started out as a quest giver, but her haughty personality, her immense power, her unique speech pattern of constantly talking in rhymes, and that laugh that all rich ladies in animes have. Yeah, you know, that laugh. Between all of that, she became beloved by the fanbase, and today, if you need anyone to represent Final Fantasy XI, you pick Shantoto. So of course, she makes it into the game. But I'm not going to put her in the base roster. Why is that? Is it because I know Final Fantasy XI fans will pay extra for Shantoto? Yes, but there's another reason. It's because I've often said that the base roster needs to establish the rules of your game, and then the DLC can break those rules. Well, in our base roster, Exdeath and Sephiroth are going to be our 2 big zoners. And then the DLC, Shantoto is going to pop in here and say, oh, that's cute, watch this. Yeah, by the time the roster is done, Shantoto is going to be the zoner of this game, raining down some of the biggest spells that you can imagine and then laughing at you as you try and fail to get past it all. However, with her short stature, she is of course going to be very limited in mobility. So if you can get past all of her attacks, she'll be in trouble. Although, speaking of her size, we do need to give her a super where she grows gigantic, either as an install or as a big cinematic level 3. Yes, there is a moment where Shantoto becomes huge, and the FF fans love that so much it comes up anytime Shantoto guest stars in anything. But our base roster character is going to be Prish. And yes, that means I am picking the 2 Final Fantasy XI characters that were also in the original Dissidia game, but what can I say? After reading up on them, they just felt like the 2 best characters to me. Prish is a major player in one of the bigger storylines from the game. To keep it simple, she's energetic and constantly running around and charging into battle, but she's also essentially immortal and nearly impervious to damage. So, how do we translate that into a fighting game? She is going to be another rushdown character. As I said, she's known for running around with a youthful energy, so she would of course have quick dashes that send her charging right into the enemy, but because of her immortality and high resistance to damage, this charge attack of hers would have armor on. And considering she would be one of the few characters to fight with her fist, she would need that armor to get past all the spells and giant swords. So that's our 2 Final Fantasy XI characters. But you know what? I think we could sneak in here a 3rd one. Not as a playable character. As I said, we're only getting 48 characters in here. But I didn't say anything about unplayable secret boss fights. Yeah, I miss those. I want more fighting games to have secret boss fights. They're just so broken, you could never put them in the hands of a player. And with Final Fantasy, there is no lack of giant big boss monsters who we could never actually make playable in the game, but they would be amazing as a secret boss fight. But specifically for Final Fantasy XI, who could possibly fit this role? As I said, I knew almost nothing about Final Fantasy XI before researching for this video, but I knew about this guy! Yeah, I have heard the stories about this character. I am putting the absolute virtue in here, and just to give you an idea of why I'm choosing them, when I typed absolute virtue into a YouTube search to find footage of them, the first video that popped up was called The Hardest Boss in Video Game History. So, this was a fight in Final Fantasy XI that was considered to be so hard, nobody could beat it. But over time, players did find little tricks to essentially cheat out a victory. At which point the devs would always say, no, that didn't count, that was an illegitimate win. And then they would patch the game so you couldn't defeat the absolute virtue the same way again. And they did this for years. So how would we interpret that into this game? As I said, make it a secret boss fight that you have to unlock in arcade mode by pulling off some crazy requirement. Then we make that character incredibly busted and strong. But then with every update and patch to the game, we buff the absolute virtue, making them even stronger. Would this infuriate players? Yes, but that's the entire point of the absolute virtue. If the players are mad, that means we did our jobs right. I said this was the era of hot takes, and with Final Fantasy XII, I gotta say it. I think this is the most underrated Final Fantasy, because this game is good. It's got a lot going for it. But because of various reasons, coming out so late after the previous Final Fantasies, changing up the combat style, following up the MMORPG that turned away a lot of the single-player fans, and of course, releasing just months before the PS3 released, meaning it was releasing on a system that was already halfway out the door, a lot of people just completely forgot about this game. But you know what? I love it. The cast of characters are so incredibly cool. The bounty hunts are some of my favorite side quests in any Final Fantasy. The gambit system is a unique way to control your party that, I'll admit, is a little rough around the edges, but it was incredibly ahead of its time. My only real big complaint about this game is that it just takes a really long time to get through fights and to walk around this map, but the Zodiac Age re-release of the game allows you to move at double speed, so yeah, if you've never played this game, it is definitely worth a look. So yes, because this game does not get a ton of recognition, I'm not going to go huge with the roster, but I definitely think it deserves more than just 2 characters, so we're going with 3. And of course, we have to start with the protagonist, Vaughn. Is a sentence I will not be saying in this video. Yeah, Vaughn is our only protagonist who I am not including, and I assure you it's not for personal reasons. No, there has been a running gag in the FF community that Vaughn is the least important protagonist in this series. Don't get me wrong, Vaughn's a good kid. It's just that outside of him and his friend Penelo, all the other members of your party have way more skin in the game. And don't get me wrong, I'm cool with a protag who is the average Joe, the outsider who gets thrown into a crazy situation. Not everybody needs to be the chosen one. But this game really treats Vaughn like he's just there. So often the other characters are having an important conversation in the foreground, while Vaughn is just hanging out in the background. Or he'll try to add to the conversation and the other characters will be like, yeah, that's nice, Vaughn. Anyways.
King Wraithwall stood here. With this sword he cut the Suncrest and took its power in his hand.
But you're going to use the sword to destroy the Suncrest. Aren't you, Ash?
Don't interrupt me, Vaughn.
So yeah, I'm sorry, Vaughn, but you ain't making the cut. Instead, I'm going to go with the character who, real talk, should have been our protagonist, Ash. She's a princess who retreated underground and formed a resistance to try and free her homeland of Dalmasca from the grip of the evil empire. She's basically Princess Leia. Yeah, Final Fantasy XII is often referred to as the Star Wars one, and you know what? Fair. It's a little blown out proportion, but I can't deny the similarities are there. Now as for how she'd fight, this was a tough call because this game sort of brought back the job system. Yeah, you can select up to 2 different roles for a character to play, meaning you could build them however you want. But each character has supers called quickenings, and they're actually unique to each character. And that's where I got the idea for Ash's moves. You see, she has 3 quickenings, and each of them involve her calling down some kind of a light energy. She has these little orbs that float around her and fire out, she brings down light from the sky, she has a big collection of energy behind her that fires out lightning. So I say we make her a setup character. You know, one of those characters whose moves set up an attack or an ability that you have to plan around later. She could have a move where she calls down orb of light that would just sit on the screen, and then after a period of time it would fire at the opponent on its own, or maybe it would trigger if the opponent ran past it. She could also call down a collection of energy that would stand behind her and fire at the opponent, allowing her some cover so that way she could run in and get close to the opponent. We don't have a setup character yet, and this feels like a good fit. Also, speaking of these quickenings, those will of course be her super moves in this game, but Ash and our next Final Fantasy XII character will have a twist to their supers. As I have already pointed out, I'm picturing that in this game, characters will have a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3 super, with a super meter that can go all the way up to 5. And that would be true for everyone, except for our Final Fantasy XII characters. No, instead, Ash and our next character will only have 3 level 1 supers. But unlike the other characters in this game, you could link their level 1s together, one after another. And if you did 3 or more of them in a row, you would unleash a big elemental blast to finish it off. Why am I allowing them to do that? Because that's exactly how the quickenings work in Final Fantasy XII. Yeah, in that game, the moment that you use a quickening, you can just keep linking them together over and over. And then when you run out your mist meter in that game, you can do a reroll to try and refill that mist meter. And if you get lucky enough, You can just do this over and over forever. Seriously, you've been watching the screen right now. It's still going. Look at this thing. Then when you're done, you'll hit the entire screen with a big elemental blast, rewarding you for how many moves you were able to link together. So, just like how all the Final Fantasy IX characters got to use trance, Ash and our next fighter will get to link their supers together. We would of course have to balance how much the damage scale is going from one super to another, so that way it's not too broken. Maybe we can make it so that each time you link a super, the timing to link the next one becomes shorter and more precise, just like in the game. But let's not pretend like there aren't fighting games out there that only allow specific characters to link their supers together. Final Fantasy XII's combat was built literally around this concept. We are of course going to make the 12 characters the ones who can do that in this game. But I've been hinting at that next character for about 5 minutes now, we should probably finally bring her up. I'm going with Fran. Don't get me wrong, I love Balthier, arguably the most charismatic character in all of Final Fantasy, but he's already in that mobile Dissidia game, he's already gained some love, and I would definitely argue that Fran is the most recognizable character in Final Fantasy XII. She's so recognizable, they even lifted her race of bunny people up out of this game and plopped them down in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, I said that you could customize how your characters fought in 12, but each of them do start with a pre-established path. There's definitely a theme that they want certain characters to follow, and Fran starts out as the archer. And you know what? Yeah, that is different. It's not throwing spells around, it's not fighting with a sword, and at this point in the video, yeah, that's a pretty good reason why you should include a character. So yeah, she would fight with a bow and arrow, but we could also give her a pretty powerful kick attack to get the opponent off of her because, well yeah, she uses a lot of powerful kicks in the game. I don't think I need to explain that one anymore. And we skipped the villain of the last 2 games, so I'm going to fix that now. We're including VIII Caritas Solidor. Now for a long time I went back and forth on whether or not I should throw him in here because while he's got a great style, I don't know if I would call him one of the more memorable Final Fantasy villains. But then over the past year, I didn't just go back and play all the old games that I had never touched, I also decided to replay 12 to refresh my memories on, and when I got to the final fight with VIII, I realized, yeah, there's no buts about it, he has to be in a fighting game. Because while all the other Final Fantasy villains have big spells and giant crazy swords, VIII is the only final boss who just throws hands. Yeah, this guy just pummels you with punches and kicks, and he's pretty good at, like, he just starts doing strings at one point in the fight. So yeah, there's no crazy gimmick to VIII, he is just going to be the combo fiend of this game. He starts punching and kicking, he keeps punching and kicking. In fact, he is going to punch and kick so hard, we will give him an install super where he transforms into his second stage from the fight, but unlike other Final Fantasy bosses who turn to giant demons or hellscape abominations, when VIII goes into his second form, he just gets really buff, meaning the punch and kick guy is going to have an install super that just lets him punch and kick harder. For many years, Final Fantasy VIII was considered the most controversial Final Fantasy because of how much people were split on. Then Final Fantasy XIII came along and said, hold my Mega Potion. Yeah, this game was not met very well at launch, and I'm not going to go into too many details about it, simply because if you are a fan of this game, I know you have heard this over and over and over again, but just to paint the picture for the people out there who are new to Final Fantasy, the game was incredibly straightforward, having almost no side quests in a franchise known for side quests. The intro tutorial went on for incredibly long, even by Final Fantasy standards, and the story made sense, but only if you were willing to constantly keep reopening up your glossary so you could remind yourself of what a Fal'Cie and a Lissi and a Seath are. So yeah, at release, this game had a lot of critics, and I think a lot of those criticisms continue to grow simply because, oddly enough, despite those problems, this game got more sequels than any other Final Fantasy up to this point, largely because Square Enix spent a whole lot of money on this game. They were going to make sure they got their use out of those character models. However, all those critiques and all those problems I just described, that's how people felt about this game upon release. Over time, opinions have changed. Mostly. This has become the big older FF fans versus younger FF fans game. In fact, recently a Final Fantasy director said that most of the new employees that they have hired over the past couple years now consider Final Fantasy XIII to be their favorite game in the series. All this is to say, this game has its problems, it has its critics, but it also has a large fan base, and that fan base should not be ignored. Although I am still only going to give them 2 characters in this roster. First one has to be Lightning. She's the protagonist of the game, and she's trying to fight against essentially God to try and save her sister and undo a cruel fate. Lightning is cool. Even the people who don't like 13 still tend to like Lightning. She's a badass, definitely has some Cloud and Squall vibes to her, and she's got a really great design. And with a name like Lightning, as you can guess, she will be all about striking hard and fast. Her game plan is to apply pressure and not let up. In fact, by this point in the video, you know I enjoy interpreting the gameplay of Final Fantasy into fighting game mechanics. Well, in many Final Fantasies, you will have a meter that fills up over time to determine when you can attack. But in 13, when that meter filled up, you didn't just do one attack, no, you would fill it up with a whole combo, and then you would unleash all those attacks at once. So let's say that when the round starts, Lightning has pretty solid pressure, but she has her own unique meter, and that meter fills up over time. And when it's full, she can burn that meter to link multiple specials together in quick succession. If she whiffs it, then she'll be wide open to a counterattack, but otherwise, this would be an amazing way to keep your opponent playing defense. Also, speaking of the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIII, one of the big goals of the combat in that game was to build up your opponent's stagger meter. When it filled up, your opponent would be vulnerable to more attacks and take more damage. So let's give Lightning a move that she has to charge up called Stagger, and when it hits the opponent, they will be temporarily stunned. It's not exactly what the move did in her game, but for our purposes here today, it's a pretty decent way to interpret it. And for the second character, just speaking in terms of mechanics, Snow is probably the most obvious choice since he's just a brawler who punches things, but yeah, I don't think most people like Snow. Again, maybe opinions have changed over the decades, but I definitely remember him not being very popular upon release. So instead, I'm going to go with Fang. Fang, in many ways, serves as a mirror to Lightning. I always felt in another world, she could have been the protagonist of this game. She's been tasked by the gods to destroy the world. She's very powerful, has one of the strongest summons, and her weapon can inflict debilitating status effects. In other words, she is going to be very offense heavy. She'll swing that staff of hers around to do big damage, but she could have special moves that inflict a negative status effect on your opponents that temporarily lower their attack or defense. And we could give her an install super where she turns into her incomplete version of Ragnarok, and then for her big level 3 super, her friend Vanille comes out and the two of them fuse together into the full version of Ragnarok. I promise you, if I stopped to explain what any of that meant, it would only be more confusing. Hey, have you heard the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV with an expanded free trial that you can play through the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning Heaven's Door expansion up to level 60 for free with no restrictions on playtime? No? You haven't? Oh. Well... crap, that's gonna make this more complicated. Yeah, so jokes aside, Final Fantasy XIV launched as another MMORPG, and it kind of flopped and was heavily criticized for just about everything. People hated this game, only to be relaunched to great praise and success, receiving tons of awards and honors, and today it's pretty big. And by pretty big, I mean the most popular thing Final Fantasy has ever done with a player base so large it's single-handedly keeping Square Enix in business. Which makes it very unfortunate for us today that this is the only other Final Fantasy that I haven't played. Well, that's not true. I have played a bit of it. At the time of this recording, I have put about 20 hours into the game. But saying that qualifies me to talk about Final Fantasy XIV is like saying I've thrown a football around a little bit, that qualifies me to be on the Jets. Then again, looking at their last season, maybe that's not so far off. My point is, I fully admit my knowledge is lacking. However, last year when I realized that I was going to do this video one day, I started looking up lore videos and watching streamers play through it, and yeah, I gotta admit, this story is pretty cool and these characters are kinda great. I still don't think I'll ever fully play through it simply because, as I have said, I'm not that into MMORPGs, and also, this game is massive. It's like the size of 7 other Final Fantasies all put together. As I said, at the time of this recording, I have put about 20 hours into this game. That puts me about a third of the way through the very first expansion. With most other Final Fantasies, I'd be approaching endgame right now. However, I definitely see what people enjoy about this game, and I have found several amazing characters in here. Sorry, I know that was a long tangent, but as I said, Final Fantasy XIV is massive with one of the most die-hard fan bases of any game in this series, so I had to make sure that those fans knew exactly why they should be mad at me for not picking the characters they wanted. Although I think everyone can be happy with this first choice, because it's Y'shtola, because of course it's Y'shtola. Now in Final Fantasy XIV, you are controlling your own creative character who does go on to be the legendary Warrior of Light, but they can't exactly sell merch of a creative character. So you also have a rich full cast of supporting characters who help to push the story along. And out of all of them, Y'shtola has easily left the biggest impact. Anytime you need someone to represent Final Fantasy XIV in a crossover, she's your gal. Problem is, she is once again a sorcerer, and we're all good on zoners at this point. We don't need any more. So I had to get creative and think of a new way for her to sling spells. But I think I've found something that makes sense. I'm going to make her another setup character, specifically a trap character. Two of the spells that she knows are Stone and Arrow, which she even uses in the last Dissidia game. So let's say that she can set up rock traps on the ground or wind traps in the air. Why am I making her a trap character? Because anytime that I hear people talk about why they love Y'shtola, they always say she's sassy. Well, what fighting style is sassier than a trap character? Let her set up traps on the field, then taunt her opponents by drinking some tea as she knows they'll never be able to reach her. Also, Y'shtola is blind, but she uses her magic to be able to see in a way that lets her dodge many attacks. She's like Daredevil if he was a magical cat girl. So we also need to give her a counter that lets her dodge out of the way. So even if you do manage to get past all of her traps, she can still escape unharmed. So that was the most obvious inclusion for 14. As I said, everyone always picks Y'shtola to be the 14 rep. But after that, man, I know you're all getting tired of hearing this, but the next choice was hard. There are so many heroes and supporting characters in this game, and all of them have their fans. But out of all the possible candidates, the one that I see getting the most love is G'raha. Yes, I know it's weird to include two cat people as the representatives for the heroes of this game, but people love G'raha. This section is already going long, so I'll just jump right to his playstyle. He uses black magic, white magic, and he even has some paladin moves. So I figure that makes him a pretty good all-rounder. He's another character who is right down the middle. Got a good variety, his moveset dips into everything, but you know what? We don't have to focus too much on any one category. But also, I know that people are going to be upset that I didn't go with some of the other Scions in this game. They're the team of heroes that you follow in Final Fantasy XIV. But G'raha was a massive fan of the Scions who got a chance to join them. And in multiple instances, he has shown he has the power to summon heroes. So, let's say for his big level 3 super, he gets a cinematic of calling out all the other Scions, and you get a big team-up attack where all of them get to do some damage. Also, when it comes to crossover games, I love when characters get unique dialogue between each other that hints at stuff from their individual storylines. So, it would be cool to see G'raha in this game talk to the Final Fantasy III characters about the Crystal Tower. Now, so far I have only included max one villain from each game. But if there is one title that should break that trend, it's the one that keeps getting new villains with each update. So I've got two coming up, and the first one is Emmett Selk. He's been present across multiple expansions and served as the main villain of Shadowbringers and is considered by many fans to be arguably the best villain of the game. Emmett's backstory is so wild that even if I said long story short, it would still be too long. But let's say that he's trying to unite all the fractured realities to bring back his own world. Emmett is an incredibly powerful sorcerer, but at this point that describes like a third of this roster. But it's true, we see him casting energy blasts, raining spears from the sky, putting up impenetrable shields, and that's all before he does the end boss special and transforms and gets a whole brand new set of moves. So here's my suggestion. Let's say that Emmett Selk has probably the largest moveset in this game. He's got specials and super moves for days. But remember, Emmett's whole plotline is trying to recreate his world by rejoining all the other shards of reality. So let's say when the match starts, Emmett only has a limited moveset, but let's give him a move called the Rejoining, and if it hits the opponent, then he gains access to even more moves, symbolizing his grand plan is coming together. I know that's not exactly how his powers work in the game, but it would make him different from everyone else in this roster, and it would be thematic to his plotline. Then we come to arguably the most anime villain in all of Final Fantasy, Xenos. He followed the classic trope of villain who was so strong that nobody could rival him until you, the player, came along and actually managed to challenge him, and now he is obsessed with you, calling you his first friend and convinced that you two are rivals, when in reality, he's kinda just a creepy stalker who thinks you two have a connection. But because he desperately wants someone who can push him to his limits, I say we give Xenos some kind of a rival gauge, and when he's dealt damage, it fills up. And then he can burn that gauge to do extra powerful versions of his moves. We could also give him some kind of a stance that he could enter where he'll take severely reduced damage, but his meter will still go up just the same. Kinda like what Raven could do in Guilty Gear. Because I can totally see Xenos also doing whatever the hell this is. And lastly, I have made it clear by now, Xenos is very focused. When he finds that person he wants to fight, he is going to hone in on them and think about nothing else. There's no gain away from him. So we have to give him a super called
A Test of Your Reflexes!
It would be a super that doesn't hit for a ton of damage, but unless you were already blocking, it would hit you no matter where you are on screen, because Xenos is always going to find you. That's a frightening thought. And that brings us to the last character from 14. And as I have pointed out many times, this game has so many beloved characters, so many amazing possible fighters, there's no way to find a character who is going to please everyone. So I'm not even going to try, and instead I'm just going to go with the weird pick. Yes, if you have been with us long enough, you know that I always say that every fighting game roster needs the weird pick. That character that makes you ask, how the heck did they get in here? It keeps your roster interesting, it gets people talking, it adds that spice that all rosters need. And when it comes to a weird pick, there's only one choice who can flex on the competition.
Very well, I and I alone, Hildebrand, Agent of Inquiry, Inspector Extraordinaire, once more accept your challenge.
Hildebrand Helidor Maximilian Manderville. Okay. For those of you who don't know, Hildebrand is not a main character in Final Fantasy XIV. He doesn't even have a voice actor. He's a recurring side character who always brings along a series of goofy quests. He believes himself to be the world's greatest detective, although it's quite clear he's mostly just a good-natured goofball who happens to get lucky. But you know what? He's got a good heart and he tries, so we love him for that. But Hildebrand isn't much of a fighter. In fact, there are many times in which he says he abhors violence. So how could he be in a fighting game? Well, there is one fighting game character that he does remind me of. Phoenix Wright from Marvel vs. Capcom. Yeah, you know how in that game, Phoenix doesn't actually throw out any punches or kicks? No, instead, all of his moves are references to jokes or cases from his series. Do the same thing here. Have each of his normal attacks be the various poses and flexes and dances that he does. Have his specials be references to his cases, like have him summon out his zombie followers to run across the stage, like Servbot. Have his assistant Nashu run out and toss bombs. For his big level 3 super, have his dad, Godbert, run out and powerbomb Hildebrand into the opponent. In fact, speaking of that, Hildebrand has to have the highest defense of any character in this game, because this guy takes a licking and keeps on ticking. He has got cartoonish levels of durability. And whenever he wins, his victory screen has to be the next time teasers that play at the end of each of his cases. Also, speaking of little Easter eggs, I need a pre-fight interaction between him and Gilgamesh where he calls him Greg. In case you can't tell, I really want this to happen. As I said, I have not played through the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV. Not even close to it. But I have been watching streamers play through all the important parts so that way I could get an understanding of this story, and I freaking love watching people play through the Hildebrand side quest. I know there were many other massively beloved important characters from 14. You could probably make a fine game entirely just around this title alone, but I think these 5 characters are a good selection of the standards, the villains, and the oddballs. The 3 things that a fighting game roster needs. And now we come to Final Fantasy XV, a game that is beloved for its rich story, the close bond of its party members, and the touching love story. At least, that's how people felt about it eventually, after the game was finished. Yeah, this might take the cake for the most troubled development of any Final Fantasy and the most confusing release strategy. The game was in development for ages, changing its plot, going from a spin-off to a mainline game, and by the time it finally released, it wasn't exactly done. The backstory of our characters and the entire plot of the game wasn't told in the game. It was told in YouTube animated shorts and in a full-blown movie that was released in theaters, not in the game you just bought. Then there were many times in which important characters would just leave the story and then return later and say, "Boy, you wouldn't believe the adventure I just had." Yeah, we wouldn't, because it's not here. Yeah, you had to wait for multiple DLC stories to release before you had the full scope of the story, including who the villain was and what his motivations were. At release, this game left a lot of players upset. However, if you play the game now, yeah, it's actually really good, and it's got some of the deepest bonds between any characters that you're likely to find in this entire series, as well as a gratuitous in-game product placement for cup noodles. Never forget that, Final Fantasy XV!
Then, if you take something already delicious like cup noodles and add in the finest, freshest ingredients, what do you get? The ultimate flavor experience.
First up, we're obviously including the game's protagonist, Noctis. I mean, heck, that guy already has experience being in a fighting game. He knows how to do a 10-string. He's the Prince of Lucis who is preparing for his wedding with a cross-country road trip. That is not an oversimplification of it, that is actually the plot. Okay, he's also out to collect the weapons of all the previous kings, which he can then wield and toss around and teleport to. So, if I had to describe Noctis' particular moveset for a fighting game, I'd say he'd be a tricky-style character. One of those fighters that takes a lot of brain work and they don't quite move or play like any other character, but if you know how to handle them, then they'd be unstoppable. Let's say that he has a move where he can throw his sword across the screen, but then it just remains wherever you tossed it. Then you can do another command to teleport to wherever that sword is, and then you can hit another button to immediately attack your opponent with one of his spectral weapons, with the weapon and the effect of the attack changing depending on what button you hit. Considering all the different angles that you could toss the sword at and how quickly you could teleport to them and how many different weapons you could attack with afterwards, it would make Noctis a character with a ton of mobility and a lot of variety to his moveset. Then we should include one of your other party members, and I know that Gladiolus seems like the smart choice. He was the muscle of the team, the one who grew up learning how to fight, but that's exactly why I'm not picking him. We already got tons of big dudes with swords in this roster. We need an X factor. We need someone different, and we need someone with a personality that will stand out among this cast. So I'm picking Ignis. Ignis is very mature and upstanding. He's the brains of your team. But more importantly, he's the chef. Yes, his culinary expertise became famous when this game released. Everyone was quoting him saying,
That's it!
What's up, Iggy?
I've come up with a new recipe.
So in this game, we'll give him his daggers for his basic attacks, but he'll also have a mechanic where he collects an ingredient. Let's say that every single time that you do one of his special moves, depending on what the special move is and what button you input when you hit the special move, a different ingredient will appear underneath your health bar. Then once you have collected 3 ingredients, if those ingredients happen to line up and create a dish, the screen will freeze and he'll shout out, "That's it!" At which point he will immediately receive a buff, with that buff being determined by what the ingredients were that you collected. And we could come up with a wide variety of different meals that he could create out of this. You create a healthy meal and you get some of your life back. You create a meal low with protein and you get stronger attacks for a limited amount of time. You create a tasty salad that fills you with energy, and now suddenly your super meter starts building faster. You do some mysterious weird combination that nobody thought of, and then all of a sudden he pulls out a cup of noodles. Again, not letting you forget about that Final Fantasy XV.
You know something? Going through all that trouble to make our own custom cup, it's made me appreciate cup noodles even more.
Perhaps we truly can't improve upon perfection.
I know that means that there would be a lot to remember in order to make Ignis work, but it feels appropriate to me that a character like him would require an entire cookbook in order to figure out his moveset. And for the final 15 character, let's include the big boss of the game, Arden Izunia. Now, without spoiling anything, let's say that Arden also has access to the spectral weapons just like Noctis, but it wouldn't make any sense to let him be teleporting around the same way that Noctis does. So instead, maybe we just have a special where the weapons fly around him for a limited amount of time, blocking out projectiles. Or better yet, I've been making Marvel vs. Capcom comparisons throughout this entire video. Give him a super where the weapons just spin around him for a limited time like Virgil. But beyond that, Arden can turn his opponents into demons, but that doesn't really apply to a one-on-one fighting game. Unless we made this a tag fighter, and then you could have Arden summon out your opponent's teammates after he defeats them as an assist. And in his little prequel DLC, we see that he has the ability to restore his own health by attacking his opponents. So let's say that each of his specials and supers require him to spend life points. But he has an attack that if it connects, will heal back that temporary life loss. Kind of like Mira in Killer Instinct. And that's it for Final Fantasy XV, which means that we now come to the present. After all this time, we have reached the last game that we're going to talk about today, Final Fantasy XVI. With Final Fantasy XIV being so incredibly successful, Square Enix decided that they would put that game's director Yoshi P in charge of their next installment, figuring he would create something that was beloved by older and newer fans alike and really reach the heart of what Final Fantasy is. Instead, he decided he was going to make something very different. He took inspiration from Game of Thrones, making this the first game in the series that would actually be M-rated. And the battles in this franchise had been leaned more towards action over the past couple installments rather than the classic turn-based combat, but 16 went so far with it, people were now comparing this to Devil May Cry. And hey, after hearing how people felt about the last couple installments in this franchise, this is probably going to be a shock to all of you, but everyone found these changes to be highly controversial. I know, never saw that coming. Many people said that Final Fantasy had now fully lost what defined it, whereas other people just saw this as a new phase in a franchise that was constantly changing. I'll admit, I do find it odd for Final Fantasy to now be rated mature, but I can't lie, I really like the story of this game. It's about a world where people born with magical powers are enslaved and persecuted. It's one big metaphor for racism because if you can't tell after all these games, Final Fantasy really likes to make statements about the world and society at large. They've been doing it ever since the start. But certain individuals don't just gain access to magic, they become what are known as dominants. They're essentially the vessels for powerful elemental beings, aka the summons from the previous games. And we follow one of these dominants as he leads a rebellion to try and bring freedom to his people and overthrow the evil kingdom. Also to kill Alien God, because it is Final Fantasy after all, you're gonna have to kill Alien God. But that dominant is of course going to be our first character, Clive, and just a side note here for a second, despite how weird some of the changes to Final Fantasy XVI felt, I still really like this game and a lot of that comes from Clive. He might be my favorite protagonist in this entire series. Every FF protag gets put through the emotional ringer, but there's something about Clive who just starts off with everything lost. He is so broken, and seeing how he struggles to build himself back up and learns to fight for others and rebuilds a family around him, I just love it. But that has nothing to do with how he's going to fight. Clive is the dominant of Ifrit, and Ifrit isn't exactly known for holding back. He is arguably the most aggressive of these ancient elemental beings known as icons. But Clive doesn't just have the power of Ifrit, he also has the power to absorb the abilities of the other icons that he defeats, giving him a massive moveset. And as I said, the combat in this game was far more action heavy. As I brought up, a lot of people were comparing this to the Devil May Cry series. So you know what? I've been drawing comparisons to Marvel vs. Capcom throughout this entire video. Clive is going to be our Dante. He's going to be incredibly aggressive, going to be a big combo fiend, going to know how to keep your opponent in the corner and constantly juggling them, but he is going to have dozens of moves that you have to remember all of them in order to make that work, making him a character with big rewards, but also very high execution. But now we come to, at long last, our final Final Fantasy fighter. And I'm going to have to go with Clive's childhood friend, love interest, and the dominant of Shiva, Jill. Jill's another great character, got her own deep emotional backstory, but in the end, the big reason why I chose her is because A, Shiva is another important staple of Final Fantasy. It would be smart to have a representative for her in this game. But also, we don't have any characters in this roster so far who specialize in ice magic. I've mentioned some spellcasters who could have one ice spell, you know, as a treat, but Jill's entire thing is ice magic. It's specifically the thing that she focuses on. So of course she's going to be able to freeze the opponent in place, slow them down, freeze the ground below them to trip them up. Listen, you've all played fighting games long enough, you know what ice characters do. In fact, that's the reason why I'm including her in the base roster over Clive. Not only do I think it's a good idea to save some of the protagonists for the DLC so that way you're not just front-loading all of them right there into the base roster, but also, as I said, Clive is going to be one of the most complex characters in this game to learn. But almost anyone who has ever played a fighting game understands the concept of an ice character. That is an archetype that a lot of players like to gravitate towards, so let's put Jill into the base roster and save the far more complex Clive for DLC. And that is every character from our hypothetical Final Fantasy fighting game. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. As I said, I know it was a far more laid-back and talky episode than our normal builder rosters, but this is a special series to me and so many other people, so I wanted to make sure that it got the time and respect that it deserved. Also, I'm sure there are many people out there who know nothing about Final Fantasy, or they only know 1 or 2 games. So I hope that I convinced some of you to check these games out. It really is an amazing series. As I said, even the games that were met with controversy and split the audiences still have fans who consider them to be their favorite installments. There really are no bad Final Fantasies, just a couple odd ones that might not be your thing. But if you've never checked these games out, I hope what you saw today gave you an idea of where you might want to start. And if you do know about Final Fantasy, and that's why you're watching the video today, but you know nothing about fighting games and you might want to know more, well then click that subscribe button. We don't just have shows where we brainstorm other fake fighting games, we also have a documentary series in which we talk about the history of real fighting games, so go ahead and check that out. Also make sure to give us a thumbs up, it tells YouTube that they should be promoting this video more. Also, if you're on mobile, apparently there's now a new button that's just for mobile called the hype button. Yeah, that's a new thing that YouTube is doing, so if you see that underneath this video, make sure that you click that as well. Also, if you want more from us, you can join our Patreon to get your name in the credits and other behind-the-scenes goodies. There will be a link to that in the description down below. And lastly, before I go, there are many people that I want to thank. Yes, for this video, I ended up assembling my own little RPG party of people that came together to help me out. First up, the artist who did the thumbnail, Sebas. I always like to tell people to go and follow the artist who did our thumbnails. I am not kidding about that. Sebas is incredibly talented. Make sure that you go and find them. I'm going to put a link to their socials down in the description below. What they made for this thumbnail was amazing. I was blown away by it. Seriously, super talented artist. Also, thank you to Dan Floyd of the Playframe YouTube channel and Joe Cat. That clip of Hildebrand talking came from their playthrough over on the Playframe channel. I mentioned this earlier, but Hildebrand does not have a voice actor in Final Fantasy XIV, but I was watching their playthrough of the Hildebrand storylines, and I was cracking up, and I absolutely loved the voice that they were doing for Hildebrand, so I was like, man, I want to use that in this video. Let me just reach out to them in the off chance that maybe they'll let me use that clip in this video, and both of them were just incredibly friendly, and just said, oh yeah, absolutely, go for it. So, thank you to both of them for that. And speaking of Final Fantasy XIV, I want to thank Kaibo the Witch, a Final Fantasy XIV superfan, and Derek Bittner of the Good Vibes Gaming YouTube channel. As I said, I have not played through all of Final Fantasy XIV yet. I have just started that game, so I did not feel that confident in the characters that I was adding to this list. So I asked on my socials if there were any big Final Fantasy XIV fans who would mind taking a look at what I had written down, and both of them volunteered and double-checked my work, so thank you both for that. But there we go, I think that is the longest outro I have ever had to do in one of these videos. Again, thank you guys for tuning in, watching through the video, and supporting the channel in all the different ways that you do. Stay safe out there, and come back next time.